Quite a few years ago, I wrote that song called Love and Fight. And it talked about, as Christians, we need to love people and we need to fight against spiritual things. And I've thought more about what that means, the spiritual things. And I'd like to say a few words about them. And I'm going to use three people who are spoken of in the New Testament primarily, who talk about that. I think I'll start with the Apostle Paul, who earlier in his life was called Saul of Tarsus, and he held the coats of the of the different men who were actively involved in fighting against what they thought, I think, was spiritual things, but they fought against an individual person who they thought embodied what they disdained about spiritual things. In other words, they thought was bad. And that person, of course, who was being martyred or put to death by these men while Saul was watching their cloaks, his name was Stephen. All right, so Saul started out thinking the way to fight a spiritual battle is by finding individual people who stood for the spiritual battle they were fighting and then just physically, in this case, killing them. Later on, he kind of changed his tune, and he was the one that wrote the words that I used as a basis for my song, Love and Fight. And that was in Ephesians where he wrote those. And he said, in essence, that we do fight. We fight with spiritual armor, spiritual breastplate, spiritual sword. Sword you think about as being an instrument of physical death. But he didn't say we're fighting physically. He said we fight against the spiritual realm, and we do so with spiritual armor. And he no longer was, I don't think, pushing for physically hurting people. He himself was physically hurt many times, but he didn't lash out and try to physically hurt others. Okay, well, now let's go to a couple more examples of people. I'm going to use kind of intertwine two people here. One used to be, Jesus called him Peter. Upon this rock I'll build my church. Now, Peter, it's interesting. Jesus in the Lord's Supper, if I read things right in the Gospels, he said, before I sent you out with no cloak, no hardly anything, but now you might need a sword, which I thought was interesting because Jesus wasn't big into swords most of his life, certainly not at the end of his life, but he said that. Well, anyway, later on, I think it was that same night, now into the early morning, a bunch of people came from the Romans and the chief priests. I guess it's really probably more the Jewish authorities. But anyway, they had swords, the people that came to arrest Jesus. Well, Peter picked up a sword. The disciples said, we have 2 swords, Jesus, is that enough? When he said you might need a sword, and Jesus said, yeah, it's enough. Well, anyway, Peter picks up one of them. I'm assuming it's one of those 2. And what does he do? He cuts off the ear of the high priest relative. Rather than Jesus saying, all right, you did exactly what I was telling you needed those swords for. Let's get them. He did not say that. Actually, what he did is he bent over, picked up the ear that had been sliced off. I suspect Peter might have been aiming for the guy's head, but Peter was a fisherman. He didn't know how to use swords very well. Anyway, Jesus picked up the ear, and he put it back on the fellow whose head now only had one ear on it. But after Jesus put the other one on, he healed it. And Jesus basically said something to Peter. A lot of times, he'll say, get thee behind me, Satan, in another place. Even though he made him that rock, he wasn't always complimentary of Peter. And he says, don't do that. He said, the person who lives by the sword will die by the sword. And Jesus didn't encourage them to use those swords for that purpose. Well, anyway, Peter learned kind of a lesson. I think he was probably a little miffed at that point, but that's just my own personal opinion. He misunderstood what Jesus meant when he said, now you need to take a sword with you on your journey. Anyway, I'm going to go into all the specifics of that other than to say Even when Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you a king?" And Jesus said, "Hey, if I was a king, my servants would be trying to overcome you." But he didn't really say that. I mean, he didn't do that. He didn't act like that. He didn't tell his servants, "Hey, get rid of the stinking Romans," like all the other Jews wanted them to do. Not all, but the leaders of the Jews wanted him to do, if he was in fact their promised Messiah. Well, anyway, he didn't do any of that stuff. And then when Jesus was on the cross, he said something. It doesn't sound like he was encouraging his followers to follow a violent way against, i.e., against people who believed something different than they did and they thought was spiritually bad. He said, "Lord, forgive them," looking out at those who were crucifying him, "for they know not what they do." Whoa. That doesn't sound like a guy who's encouraging physical violence against people who believe differently. Well, I said all that to say this. I don't want anybody to interpret the words of my song, Love and Fight, the fight part, to mean we got to go out and hurt people who seem to be empowered by a spirit, bad spirit, fight against all of the devil's schemes. Let's say we think someone embodies a devil's scheme. We still don't go out and try to physically hurt their body. What do we fight against then? Well, we're not fighting against their bodies. We're not fighting against flesh and blood. What are we fighting against? We're fighting against the powers that control the air, the powers of the earth that pretty much controlled it before Jesus showed up. And then Jesus said, "Now all authority has been granted to me in heaven and on earth." So actually Jesus has the authority now. We're fighting in the spiritual realms for that which controls people. We don't fight the people, we fight what controls them. And often that can be a spirit of anti-God, which often may, in fact, translate itself in often individual people that don't say the things that I like. That's not what we're after either. We're just not after people fighting in that way. We fight the spirit that controls folks. And we don't fight it with violence. We fight it with love. Jesus said, "Love your enemies." Oh, that almost sounds like what he said on the cross. He said, "Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, despitefully use you." And I think that's because he knew that you get that spirit out of them, they're going to be the way God made them, made in the image of God, not without that spirit. Not with that spirit, I should say. With the Spirit of God, which is not one that tries to hurt people physically, but rather wants to help them in any way they can. Those are my opinions about my own song. We've got to love, we got to fight. I'll sing it again for you right now, but you can cut this off if you've already heard it other way places. We've got to love and we've got to fight. We've got to love one another and the things that are right. We've got to wear God's armor of spiritual things so we can fight against all of the devil's schemes. With the belt of truth buckled round our waist and the breastplate of righteousness in place and our feet fitted with the gospel of peace, we're fighting in the battle of spiritual things. Yeah, we got to love and we've got to fight. We've got to love one another and the things that are right. We've got to wear God's armor of spiritual things so we can fight against all of the devil's schemes. With the helmet of salvation on our heads and the shield of faith in our hands, and faith in what God has done well, we will prevail against the gates of hell. Yeah, we got to love and we got to fight. We've got to love one another and the things that are right. We've got to wear God's armor of spiritual things so we can fight against all of the devil's schemes. All right. I forgot some of the words, but hey, that's the general impression. I love you guys. I don't know who's listening to me, but I probably love you all, actually, in one sense or another, even the ones who radically disagree with the way I see things. But hey, I'm glad you're made in the image of God, and I'm glad you get to see things different than me. Mighty, I learned, I'm old as you can see, but I learned, I don't know when it was, but at some point I learned the following very important thing. I'm not nearly as smart as God, and the world is a heck of a lot better place off that I'm not doing what he's supposed to do. Which probably means that a lot of the ways in which you disagree with me, you're a lot more on the right track than I am. So whatever, I'm not bashful to say what I think. Those of you who know me personally are aware of that. Sometimes I get myself in trouble, but hey, just wanted to clarify what I mean when in my song I say, we've got to love. Well, you probably know what that means. And we got to fight. That's a little harder to know about, but I gave you 3 examples of what not to do, what fighting doesn't mean in the Christian arena. And you can read a lot of what Jesus said about loving your enemies, that kind of stuff. It's counterintuitive, but it's what Jesus says, and it's hard for us Christians sometimes to follow it because we got the same kind of issues in us that anybody else has in them. We tend to want to do things our own way and think that we got the better idea of what God really wants. And that's our challenge. Find out what God really wants and do it and appreciate what he's done and recognize that we're not God, he is. That's what I try to do. Now, I haven't always been this way, but that's what I try to do now. All right, I better bring this to a close because I'm running out of storage on my iPhone. I may have overdone it. I may have just totally overdone it, as I do so often. Bye-bye.